Let's start by talking about leadership. Is there one piece of advice or one tip that particularly stands out for you on leadership?
I think I hardly consider myself an expert, but the thing that I think about the most is something that Don Graham, my uncle and the CEO and chairman of the company, said to me years ago. He said, Catherine, you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You have to surround yourself with the smartest people in the room and listen. And that is what I try to do.
Surround yourself with the smartest people and listen. And in fact, that's why we have this group together, the smartest people and to listen. As you know, in our 35-year history here at the Point Institute, this is not the first time we've gathered important leaders together. In fact, in 1985, we produced a series on news leaders named News Leaders. Back then, we looked at the leaders of the industry. I want to take you back 25 years ago now, Jeff, and let's look at some of the things, something that was said then.
People say, how did you have the courage to go to work and take over? And the fact is that I guess I didn't know what I was doing, and therefore I can't describe it as this great courageous move. It was sort of putting one foot in front of the other and going forward. Looking back on it, of course, I realized that much of how I was treated was a factor of my being a woman, by certain people, not by everybody. And the other thing, that you just are condescended to, and strangely, in some situations I still am, because people are simply not used to a woman as the chief executive officer of a company, and in fact, I am the only chief executive officer who's a woman of the top Fortune 500, or I think even 1,000, or at least I was for a long time, and I believe I still am. We still have to make it the other half of the way, and so I think women really do have to be doubly good, and it's not fair, but they still have to be better than men. When we will have achieved equality is when the average woman will be considered in the same light as the average man. It's still the stars among us that make it.
It's still the stars among us that make it. If your grandmother were here today and you wanted to describe to her the state of women in the media today, what would you tell her?
I think I would say, and I know most of what she felt like, what it was like from her book. I think I would say the world has changed a lot. It's not perfect. We obviously have a ways to go, but there are tons of women in journalism now. We obviously have to do better in the top ranks. We have a woman as a managing editor, and we have lots of women editors. The Columbia Journalism School graduating class, I was told recently, was 63% women. So I feel like it is pretty normal for women to be in business and in journalism, and some of the challenges that I see for women are often the how do you have kids and juggle it and do your career, and how far up the chain do you want to go, and what sacrifices are you willing to make, and then of course what opportunities are you offered. But I think we've come a long way.
I was a little surprised that that's the way the edited interview with her began, because as I read her book, I didn't think that that was foremost on her mind, the state of women. Does it come to your mind very often?
Well, I think in her case, she went right straight from being a mother at home, having raised 4 kids, to being CEO. So she didn't know what it was like to go up the ranks, right? But she knew what it was like to be the only woman on the board of the AP. And there's that picture of her that she has in her book that I love, where she is literally the only woman in a room of, 50 men. It's an amazing photo. So,
That is a great photo, and those of you who will be here tomorrow will probably see it. It's a great photo if you hadn't seen it. It's a long table of men and Katharine Graham. Let's talk about news media. Again, let's assume she's here. How would you describe to her the state of news media today?
Well, we're obviously in a huge state of transition. I don't think I need to tell anyone here in this room anyway. But I think it's also incredibly exciting, and I think she would see that. You know, I mean, I flew down here today with my 2 little kids, and they watched SpongeBob on the iPad. And, you know, the other day, or a couple of months ago, I was driving my then 9-year-old to school, and she was playing on the iPhone. And I said, I just thought, she has to know. I said, Madeline, you know, when I was growing up, we didn't have computers, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have, you know, DVD players, whatever. And she looked at me completely seriously, and she was like, wow, Mommy, it must have been hard growing up in the olden days. Right? Like, it's unfathomable that, you know, my 4-year-old didn't know how to read, but she knew how to get to YouTube and get Dora videos. So, you know, it's scary from the business perspective. How do you sustain quality journalism? But the demand for news and the ability to get news is greater than ever. I mean, we have, you know, people write about and talk a lot about the decline of circulation in newspapers and, oh my God, what's happening. We have a bigger audience than we have ever had. You know, 90% of our page views for WashingtonPost.com come from outside the Washington area, and roughly 10 to 15% of those are international. And we don't distribute outside of the Washington region. So for us, it's enabled us to get an audience that's all over the world for the incredible journalism that we put out. So, you know, our challenge is to figure out, how do you pay for it?
Okay. So what's the answer?
I was going to ask you. Well, I don't have the answer. I'm not a believer that there's a magic bullet, but if I find it or if any of you have it, I'd love to take it. But I think, you know, when you look at the history of journalism, it really is, and people have written a lot about this, it's an anomaly. I mean, the profitability that newspapers sustained in this last century was an anomaly. I mean, newspapers were not profitable for most of their lives. And as Warren Buffett would say, when it was profitable, it was a toll booth. It was a brilliant model. If you were an advertiser and you wanted to reach the local audience, you had to advertise in the newspaper. So our classified sections, for those of us local newspapers, were terrific and brought us in hundreds of millions of dollars. If you were going to buy a car, if you were going to get a job, you went to the Washington Post. Of course, you still do today, but just maybe online. So, you know, the whole world has changed. People are on Craigslist and eBay and Monster and AutoTrader and you name it. We have 1,000 different companies coming after almost every niche we're in. So you know, I think when we had money to invest, we invested it back in the newsroom, which is where we should invest it. But at this point, we have to cut back. We have to have a smaller cost structure, which is not fun and it's not glamorous. But in order to sustain the kind of quality journalism we all believe in, we have to do that so that we can continue to do it and continue to invest in our journalism and at the same time experiment on new platforms, right? We are going to be on the iPad. We are on the iPhone. You can have, you know, podcasts. You can get us on the internet. So we will be where our readers want to be.
Now, you came to this position after training as a lawyer, Harvard and Stanford, a hard life, Harvard and Stanford, and then moving into advertising. What will happen with advertising online? What do you see as a future of online advertising?
I think it's hard to say because it's changing so fast. I mean, when you think about it, right, I mean, the Washington Post has been around for, you know, well over 100 years. The internet has been around, at least sort of in the popular consumption, for, 15 years? So it's changing so quickly, and I think none of us know what it will look like. Even as we're planning for what we're going to do on the iPad, it's so new. You know, none of us know exactly what is an ad going to look like. Is it going to look like a display ad in the newspaper? Is it going to be video? Is it, you know, it's, you know, in a way, it's like, you know, the Harry Potter description of a newspaper with a moving photo. You know, so I think the answer is advertising right now on the internet is challenged because there are so many page views and CPMs are declining. But I think it's going to change a lot. And the key, obviously, is I was at a conference recently, and one of the clients there said something that I think is so true. He said, you know, he was talking about social media, which is all the rage these days, right? And he said, am I going to advertise on Facebook and Twitter? Absolutely. Why? Because it's cheap and my employer thinks I'm doing social media. He said, but what do I care about at the end of the day? Does it ring my cash register? That's what they care about. If we can find a way for advertisers to connect with their consumers, and that's what newspapers are brilliant at,